from what I have seen in my experience, deaf people have been relegated to sitting at the back of the church. They're not really part of the congregation. One of the things that's important is that deaf people sit up front and closer. And so that they can see the interpreter and so that they can see, because of course they're depending on their eyes to receive the message. But a lot of churches still don't understand that. They reserve the front pews for mothers or other smaller groups, and don't understand the importance of letting deaf people sit up front. Well, the access that would be provided to deaf people would be through a deaf minister, one who uses the same language as other deaf people do, which is American Sign Language here in the United States, or through the use of interpreting services, someone who is qualified and credentialed and bilingual in American Sign Language and English, and can interpret what the preacher is saying for the deaf members of the congregation. So an interpreter serves the same purpose as a ramp in providing access. If the interpreter knows American Sign Language, they might be doing an adequate job in getting the message across, but generally church interpreters tend to sign in English, and which is not the natural language of deaf people, which is American Sign Language. Also, there's the issue of literacy. Deaf people don't read the Bible themselves, so they depend on hearsay and get conflicting stories about different things in the Bible from people that they meet. We mentioned that statistic of 98% of deaf people not knowing Christ. Several months ago, it was about 4 months ago, I had a person come up and ask me, why would God take a good man? And I asked him about his own soul and about being saved, and he questioned, why would God take a good man? And I said, who among us really is good? God is the only good that we know, truly. People may see good deeds that people do, and people may do wonderful deeds and not be saved. It breaks my heart to know how many deaf people we have lost and who have died without being saved. Just this past Friday, 2 deaf young people died, and neither one of them knew anything about Jesus and were not saved. They might have gone to church, but they didn't learn about Jesus and didn't learn about God. I want to stress how important it is that churches that do hire interpreters, that interpreters be very proficient in American Sign Language. A qualified interpreter is able to take the intent and the message that the preacher is presenting based on his knowledge and calling from God and his knowledge of the Bible and his education, take that and package it in a way so that it is an equivalent rendering. And the only way to make sure you're giving an equivalent rendering of what the preacher is saying is to have an objective body assess whether or not you're doing that. And we, being humans, aren't capable of recognizing that in ourselves oftentimes, and it takes an objective body, an outsider, to look and say, yes, you do know what you're doing, and yes, you're doing it correctly. And that can be painful sometimes for people, because they feel, I've met many folks who feel passionately that this is their thing, that this is what God has called them to do. And if that is the case, if that is truly the case, and only you and God know that, then you are commanded to do it to the best of your ability and your skills. And God doesn't care about the things that we have in this world, the possessions that we acquire. He cares about us and about us bringing His message to people. A question I heard posed was, why, if it's important enough to have a qualified person who was bilingual and professionally trained to interpret, if that's important enough for a child's academics in school, and if it's important enough for a legal situation, if it's important enough for a hospital situation, how could it not possibly be the most important thing to not gamble with someone's soul? Churches that do have interpreters tend to be unqualified and uncredentialed interpreters. They're not nationally certified or anything like that. Deaf people a lot of times don't understand the issues about professionalism. If the, I guess a standard that could be blanketly stated would be ask their interpreters if they have national certification. And that qualifies them in bilingual interpreting. What I have seen in churches that successfully integrate a deaf population of the congregation in the hearing is through the use of interpreting services, through the use of teaching sign language classes to the congregation, so that when a deaf person walks through the front door, they're greeted with somebody or by somebody who can speak a little bit of their language. And it's that barrier. One of the things that Helen Keller said was that my blindness separates me from things and my deafness separates me from people. And that's what bonds us together is language, is a common language. So it's not, of course, expected that everyone in the church congregation would learn American Sign Language, but just providing that access to the preacher's words and therefore to God's words, and just a friendly greeting in a language that everyone can understand. That's very important. One time I gave the sermon at our church, but the way our church is set up is we have the mixed congregation where the service is interpreted, where deaf and hearing are all together. And then on alternating Sundays, the deaf worshipers come down and I present the message to them. A few states do have where the pastor actually alternates hearing deaf, but that's rare. I've met some people who've belonged to churches that have successfully combined hearing and deaf, and the way they've worked it is on alternate Sundays, the whole congregation worships together with one preacher whose sermon is interpreted. On the other alternate Sundays, a deaf preacher who is a member and equal status at that church will take the deaf congregates down into their room, so that there's simultaneously the sermon is presented in spoken English and directly from a deaf preacher. And that seems to work wonderfully because there's opportunity for everyone to worship together, and then there's opportunity to have the sermon presented directly in your own language and not necessarily interpreted. So it's been neat to see that kind of a success and everyone together learning about God.